James Washington adjusted his rearview mirror as he drove home from his weekly Veterans Support Group meeting. At 68, the decorated Vietnam veteran had settled into a peaceful routine in Maplewood, the small town he'd called home for the past 4 decades. The autumn evening was quiet, with streetlights casting long shadows across the empty roads. He was just 3 blocks from his house when the police cruiser's lights flashed behind him. Washington checked his speedometer. He'd been driving exactly at the limit. With decades of experience as a law-abiding citizen, he knew the drill. He pulled over carefully, turned off the engine, and placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be clearly seen. Officer Richard Miller approached the car, his flashlight beam unnecessarily bright as it swept across Washington's face. The veteran squinted but maintained his composure, drawing upon years of military discipline. "License and registration," Miller barked, his tone immediately hostile. Washington noticed the officer's hand already resting on his holster, despite there being no indication of threat. "Yes, sir," Washington replied calmly, slowly reaching for his wallet. "My registration is in the glove compartment. I'm going to reach for it now, if that's all right." Miller didn't respond, watching with obvious suspicion as Washington retrieved his documents. The veteran couldn't help but notice how the officer's demeanor shifted when he saw the military ID alongside the driver's license. "Step out of the vehicle," Miller ordered, ignoring the proper documentation in his hand. Washington's heart sank, but he complied. "May I ask what seems to be the problem, officer?" "Shut up and turn around," Miller snapped, roughly grabbing Washington's arm. The veteran winced as his bad shoulder, injured during his service, was wrenched behind his back. "Officer, there's no need for." Washington started, but was cut off by Miller pushing him against the car. "I said shut up. You people never learn, do you?" Miller's words carried a weight of prejudice that Washington had hoped was fading from the world his grandchildren were growing up in. The next few minutes were a blur of unnecessary force and degrading treatment. Miller conducted an aggressive search, ignoring Washington's attempts to explain his recent shoulder surgery. The veteran endured it silently, his military training helping him maintain his dignity, even as the officer's actions grew increasingly inappropriate and unprofessional. Nearby residents began to notice the commotion. Mrs. Rodriguez, Washington's neighbor for 20 years, stepped onto her porch. She recognized him immediately and started recording with her phone, her hands shaking with anger and concern. "You're under arrest for resisting," Miller announced, though Washington hadn't resisted at all. "Officer, I respect your authority, but this is wrong," Washington said quietly, his voice steady despite the pain in his shoulder. "I've served this country, and I know my rights." Miller's response was to tighten the handcuffs beyond what was necessary. "Your service doesn't mean anything to me, old man. You fit the description of a suspect." As Washington was roughly guided into the back of the patrol car, he caught glimpses of more neighbors gathering. Young Tommy Parker, whose father Washington had mentored through PTSD, was already on his phone, presumably calling for help. In the back of the police car, Washington sat straight-backed, his military bearing evident despite the circumstances. His mind wasn't on the humiliation or the pain. It was already working on what needed to be done next. This wasn't just about him anymore. If an elderly veteran could be treated this way, what about other vulnerable members of the community? As they drove toward the station, Washington remembered his commanding officer's words from Vietnam. "Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stay calm in the face of injustice, and then work to make sure it never happens again." The police station's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Washington was processed. Other officers watched uncomfortably, some recognizing him from his community work with veterans, but none intervened. The charge was listed as resisting arrest and suspicious behavior, though no evidence was provided. As he sat in the holding cell, Washington's military training kicked in once again. He began mentally documenting every detail of the encounter, every word exchanged, every witness present. This wasn't going to be just another incident swept under the rug. He had fought for his country once, and now it seemed he needed to fight for justice in his own hometown. Little did Officer Miller know, his actions that night would set in motion a chain of events that would transform not just the Maplewood Police Department, but police-community relations across the entire state. The holding cell was cold, but James Washington's spirit remained unbroken. After 3 hours, Sergeant Patricia Martinez entered the area, her face showing clear concern when she recognized the respected veteran. "Mr. Washington, I just got word of your arrest. I'm so sorry about this situation," she said, quickly unlocking the cell. "We're releasing you immediately. All charges have been dropped." Washington stood slowly, his shoulder still aching from Officer Miller's rough handling. "Thank you, Sergeant, but this isn't just about me anymore." Outside the station, Washington found a small crowd had gathered. Mrs. Rodriguez was there with her phone footage, along with several other neighbors and members of his veterans group. Among them stood Marcus Chen, a young civil rights attorney who had helped the veterans organization with legal matters in the past. "Mr. Washington," Chen called out, stepping forward. "Mrs. Rodriguez sent me the video. What Officer Miller did was completely unacceptable. We need to talk." The next morning, Washington's modest kitchen table became an impromptu command center. Chen spread out documents showing previous complaints against Officer Miller, while Mrs. Rodriguez's viral video played on a laptop. The footage had already reached 100,000 views overnight. "Look at these patterns," Chen explained, pointing to the paperwork. "Miller has 17 complaints in the past year alone, all involving minority citizens, all swept under the rug. But they didn't have your credibility, your witnesses, or video evidence." Washington studied the documents, his military-trained mind analyzing the situation like a tactical operation. "These aren't just statistics," he said quietly. "These are people, our neighbors, someone's parents, children, grandparents." His phone kept buzzing with messages of support. The local news wanted interviews. Even his old platoon members from Vietnam were calling, offering to fly in and stand with him. But Washington had a different approach in mind. "We're not going to fight this with anger," he declared, surprising everyone in the room. "We're going to fight it with truth and dignity." That afternoon, Washington visited the town's 3 biggest churches, 2 mosques, and the synagogue. He spoke with community leaders, business owners, and other veterans. By evening, he had organized a town hall meeting for the following day. The community center was packed. Officer Miller sat in the back, looking uncomfortable but required to attend by his superiors. Sergeant Martinez was there too, along with the police chief and the mayor. Washington stood at the podium, his military bearing commanding attention. He didn't raise his voice or point fingers. Instead, he shared stories, not just his own, but those of others who had faced similar treatment. "I didn't serve my country to come home and watch my neighbors live in fear of those sworn to protect them," he said. "And I know most of our police officers are good people who feel the same way." Then he did something unexpected. He invited Officer Miller to the podium. "Son," Washington said, facing the man who had humiliated him just days before, "I want to understand what made you treat any human being that way, because until we understand the problem, we can't fix it." Miller stood frozen, sweat visible on his forehead. The entire room held its breath. This wasn't the angry confrontation they had expected. This was something different, an opportunity for truth, for change. To everyone's surprise, Miller walked to the podium. His hands were shaking as he took the microphone. I was wrong," Miller began, his voice barely audible. "I've been wrong a lot, and I've been too proud to admit it." Washington placed a steady hand on the younger man's shoulder, the same shoulder Miller had wrenched during the arrest. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone in the room. As part 2 of this story drew to a close, the meeting had evolved into something more than just a response to one incident. In that community center, with former adversaries standing side by side, the seeds of real change were being planted. Local news cameras captured every moment, but they couldn't capture the full weight of what was happening. This wasn't just about police reform anymore. It was about a community learning to face its problems with wisdom instead of anger, with hope instead of hate. And at the center of it all stood James Washington, a veteran who had found himself fighting a new kind of battle, one that would require all the courage, strategy, and compassion he had learned in his years of service. The days following the town hall meeting brought unexpected changes to Maplewood. Word of Washington's approach spread beyond the town limits, catching the attention of national media. But the veteran remained focused on his real mission, creating lasting change in his community. Officer Miller's admission at the town hall had opened a door. Early one morning, he arrived at Washington's house, not in his police uniform, but in civilian clothes. The veteran invited him in for coffee. "I've been thinking about resigning," Miller confessed, staring into his cup. "After everything I've done." Washington shook his head. "Running away won't fix anything. What we need are officers who've learned from their mistakes and want to do better." Together, they developed a plan. Miller would work with Washington to create a new training program for the police department. They would combine Washington's military experience in community relations with real stories from local residents who had faced discrimination. Sergeant Martinez proved to be a valuable ally. She helped arrange meetings between veteran officers and community members, setting up informal coffee sessions where both sides could talk openly about their fears and expectations. "This is how real trust begins," Washington explained during one session, "not with big speeches or new rules, but with people actually listening to each other." The changes weren't always smooth. Some officers resisted, viewing the new initiatives as criticism of their work. A few community members thought Washington was being too forgiving, but he pressed on, drawing on the same patience that had kept him alive in Vietnam's jungles. One breakthrough came when Washington brought in his old military training methods. He introduced role-playing exercises where officers and civilians would switch positions, each experiencing the other's perspective. The impact was immediate and profound. "I never understood how intimidating we could seem," one young officer admitted after playing the role of a civilian being pulled over. "Even when we're trying to do everything by the book." Miller, who had initially struggled with his new role, found himself becoming an unexpected advocate for change. His transformation from antagonist to ally became a powerful example of what was possible. "If someone like me can learn to see things differently," he told a group of cadets at the police academy, "anyone can." The program's success caught the attention of neighboring towns. Police chiefs from across the state began calling, asking Washington to share his methods. But he insisted on keeping things personal and local. "Real change happens face to face," he would say. "It can't be rushed or forced." 3 months after that fateful traffic stop, Washington stood before the city council. The room was packed with faces that had become familiar during his campaign for change: officers, community members, local leaders, and media representatives. "What happened to me was wrong," he began, his voice steady and clear. "But what's happening now is right. We're not just talking about change anymore, we're living it." The council was voting on a new set of police reforms, developed collaboratively by Washington's team of officers and community members. The proposals included mandatory cultural sensitivity training, regular community dialogue sessions, and a civilian oversight committee. As Washington looked around the room, he saw Officer Miller sitting next to Mrs. Rodriguez, both of them nodding in support. Sergeant Martinez was there with a group of rookie officers who had gone through the new training program. Even some of the initially skeptical veterans had come around. The reforms passed unanimously. Later that evening, Washington sat on his porch, enjoying the quiet of a peaceful night. A police cruiser drove by slowly, and the officer inside waved. A simple gesture that would have seemed impossible just months ago. His phone buzzed with a message from Miller. "Just finished my first sensitivity training session as an instructor. Never thought I'd be doing this. Thank you for not giving up on me." Washington smiled, remembering something his old sergeant had told him in Vietnam. "Sometimes the bravest thing isn't charging into battle, it's having the courage to change." As the sun set over Maplewood, Washington knew that their work was far from over. Change was a continuous process, not a destination, but for the first time in a long time, he felt confident that his community was moving in the right direction. The incident that could have divided their town had instead brought them together, proving that even the darkest moments could lead to light, if people were brave enough to face them with wisdom, compassion, and hope. As Maplewood's police reform program gained momentum, new challenges emerged. One rainy morning, Washington received an unexpected visitor, FBI agent Sarah Thompson. "Mr. Washington," she said, settling into his living room, "we've been monitoring your community program. What you've achieved here is remarkable, but there's something you need to know about Officer Miller's past." The agent revealed that Miller had previously worked in 3 other police departments, leaving each under suspicious circumstances. Files had been sealed, complaints buried. Washington listened carefully, his military training helping him maintain his composure despite the disturbing revelations. We believe your program may have inadvertently given him a platform to avoid accountability, Agent Thompson explained. Washington sat in silence for a moment, processing this information. Sometimes, he finally said, the biggest test of our principles comes when they're hardest to defend. That afternoon, he called an emergency meeting with Sergeant Martinez and his advisory team. Miller was conspicuously absent. We have a choice to make, Washington told them. We can either abandon our belief in redemption, or we can show what true accountability looks like. The team worked through the night, revising their program. They added strict accountability measures, regular psychological evaluations, and a transparent reporting system for all officers involved in the reform efforts. The next morning, Washington confronted Miller in the police station break room. You didn't tell us everything, Washington said quietly. Miller's face paled. I was afraid. Afraid that if people knew everything, they wouldn't believe I could change. Change isn't just about words, Washington replied. It's about facing our past honestly. Are you ready to do that? What followed was one of the most difficult phases of the program. Miller voluntarily disclosed his full history to the department and the Oversight Committee. Some community members called for his immediate dismissal, but Washington stood firm. Real justice isn't about punishment alone, he explained at a heated community meeting. It's about transformation. If we believe in change, we have to be willing to see it through, even when it's messy. The program adapted. Miller was placed on probation, required to undergo intensive counseling, and had to meet regularly with people he had wronged in his previous positions. It was painful, but necessary. Unexpectedly, this crisis strengthened the program. Other officers, inspired by Miller's vulnerability, began opening up about their own struggles and biases. The wall of silence that often surrounded police misconduct began to crack. One young officer stood up during a training session and admitted to racial profiling in his traffic stops. Another veteran officer acknowledged how his war experiences had affected his judgment on the job. The honesty was uncomfortable but transformative. Washington brought in mental health professionals to work with both officers and community members. Together, they developed new protocols for addressing trauma, both the trauma inflicted by police misconduct and the trauma officers themselves carried. Healing has to happen on both sides, Washington explained to a group of skeptical activists. We can't build trust if we're all carrying around unaddressed wounds. The FBI continued to monitor the situation, but even Agent Thompson was impressed by the program's evolution. You've turned a potential crisis into an opportunity for deeper reform, she told Washington. This could become a model for departments across the country. As Part 4 drew to a close, Miller stood before a group of police cadets from the State Academy. His hands were shaking as he held his prepared speech, but he set it aside. I'm not here to make excuses, he began. I'm here to show you what happens when we stop hiding from our mistakes and start learning from them. Washington, watching from the back of the room, saw heads nodding. The cadets were listening not just to Miller's words, but to the authentic struggle in his voice. Later that evening, Washington sat in his study, updating the program's manual. He added a new section titled Crisis and Opportunity, How to Handle Program Setbacks. Sometimes, he wrote, our biggest challenges become our greatest teachers. The key is not to avoid difficulties, but to face them with honesty, courage, and a commitment to growth. Outside, a new shift of officers was starting their patrol, each one wearing a small pin that read "Change starts within," a reminder that the hardest battles are often the ones we fight with ourselves. 6 months into the reform program, Maplewood faced its first major test. A video surfaced online showing a violent arrest from 2 years ago, involving 3 current officers who had been actively participating in Washington's initiative. The footage was brutal. The officers had used excessive force against a teenage boy during a minor shoplifting incident. The boy's family had moved away shortly after, and the incident had been buried, until now. Washington watched the video in his living room, surrounded by his core team. The silence was heavy. This is it, Sergeant Martinez said quietly. This is where we prove if our program really works. Instead of circling the wagons or making excuses, Washington took an unprecedented step. He invited the media to the police department and played the video on a large screen, with the 3 officers present. We're not here to hide from this, Washington announced. We're here to show what real accountability looks like. The officers, who had become respected members of the reform program, stepped forward one by one. Officer Jenkins, the senior officer from the video, spoke first. "That video shows who I was," he said, his voice shaking. "But it doesn't show who I'm becoming. I want to make this right." Washington worked with Attorney Chen to locate the boys' family in their new city. They flew them back to Maplewood, not for a lawsuit, but for something more powerful, a restorative justice session. The meeting took place in the community center. Marcus, the teenager from the video, now 17, sat across from the officers who had assaulted him. His parents watched nervously as Washington facilitated the dialogue. "Tell them what that day did to you," Washington encouraged Marcus. For 2 hours, Marcus spoke about his fear of police, his nightmares, his loss of trust in authority. The officers listened, tears streaming down their faces. Then they shared their own stories, not as excuses, but as context for their journey toward change. The session ended with a commitment to action. The officers would face appropriate disciplinary measures, but they would also work with Marcus to develop a youth outreach program, using their experience to prevent similar incidents. "Pain can either break us or transform us," Washington told the group. "Today, we choose transformation." The story made national headlines, but not for the reason many expected. Instead of another scandal, it became an example of how police departments could handle past misconduct while moving forward. Other departments started sending observers to Maplewood. They wanted to learn how to implement similar programs in their cities. Washington insisted that any visiting officers participate fully in the process, including sharing their own mistakes and biases. One afternoon, Washington received a call from Marcus. "Mr. Washington," the teenager said, "I want to join the youth program. Not just as a participant, I want to help run it." This led to the creation of the Bridge program, where young people who had negative encounters with police worked directly with officers to create better understanding on both sides. The 3 officers from the video became some of the program's strongest advocates. They shared their story at police academies across the state, showing both their worst moments and their path to redemption. "We can't change the past," Officer Jenkins would say, "but we can change how it shapes the future." As Part 5 drew to a close, Washington stood before a graduating class of new officers. Among them was Marcus's older brother, inspired by the changes he'd seen in Maplewood. "Your badge is not just a symbol of authority," Washington told them. "It's a commitment to continuous growth, honest reflection, and the courage to face your mistakes." That evening, Washington added another chapter to the program manual, "Confronting the Past, a Guide to Handling Historical Misconduct." The chapter began with a quote from his old military days. "The true measure of strength is not in never falling, but in how we rise after we fall." Outside his window, he could see Marcus and Officer Jenkins setting up for tomorrow's youth program meeting. They were laughing about something, their previous roles of victim and aggressor transformed into partners for change. Washington smiled, knowing that true healing wasn't about forgetting the past, but about using it to build a better future. Part 6, A Veteran's Stand for Justice, 780 words. An unexpected crisis hit Maplewood just as the reform program was gaining national recognition. A series of armed robberies had residents on edge, and some community members began calling for a return to more aggressive policing tactics. Washington watched from his porch as extra patrol cars circled the neighborhoods. The tension was palpable, threatening to unravel months of progress. "We're losing public support," Officer Miller reported during an emergency meeting. "People are scared, and they're saying our new approach is too soft." Washington leaned forward in his chair, his military experience kicking in. "This is our chance to prove that effective policing doesn't require sacrificing dignity or rights." He assembled a special task force combining reformed officers with community leaders. Instead of reverting to old tactics, they developed a new strategy focusing on community intelligence and preventive measures. Marcus, now a regular participant in the youth program, provided valuable insight. "These robberies are happening where young people feel disconnected from the community. We need to address that." The task force set up neighborhood watch groups, but with a twist. Each group included both civilians and off-duty officers working together. They organized youth activities in high-risk areas and improved lighting in vulnerable spots. Officer Jenkins, one of the reformed officers from the viral video incident, came up with an innovative idea. He proposed converting empty storefronts into community engagement centers, staffed jointly by police and local volunteers. Instead of just patrolling these areas, he explained, we need to be part of them. The strategy worked, but not in the way everyone expected. While investigating one of the robberies, Sergeant Martinez discovered that the perpetrators were a group of desperate former factory workers who had lost their jobs when the local plant closed. Washington saw an opportunity to demonstrate the program's comprehensive approach to public safety. He brought together local business leaders, the police department, and social services to create a job placement program for unemployed residents. Crime prevention isn't just about law enforcement, he told the city council. It's about addressing the root causes of desperation. The robbers were eventually caught, but instead of seeking maximum punishment, Washington advocated for a restorative justice approach. The offenders would face consequences, but would also receive job training and support to reintegrate into the community. Some critics called this approach naive, but Washington stood firm. I've seen enough punishment in war to know it doesn't solve the underlying problems. The controversy attracted the attention of a major news network. They sent a team to film a documentary about Maplewood's unique approach to crime and community healing. During filming, one of the former robbers, James Parker, spoke directly to the officers who had arrested him. You treated me like a human being even when I was at my worst, he said. That's what made me want to change. The documentary crew captured a powerful moment when Parker, now employed in training others, joined one of the community engagement centers as a volunteer. Washington used these experiences to create a new training module called Crisis Response with Dignity. It emphasized understanding the social contexts of crime while maintaining professional law enforcement standards. One evening, as Washington reviewed the latest crime statistics showing a significant drop in both robberies and use of force incidents, he received an unexpected visitor. It was the police chief from a major city 3 states away. We've been watching what you're doing here, the chief said. Our city needs this. Will you help us implement something similar? Washington looked at the photos on his wall, images of his military service next to pictures of Maplewood's transformed police force. Change has to come from within your community, he advised. But we can show you how to start the conversation. As Part 6 concluded, Washington gathered his expanded team, officers, community leaders, reformed offenders, and youth representatives, for their weekly meeting. The room was fuller than ever. What we're doing here isn't just about policing, he told them. It's about showing that every crisis is an opportunity to build something better. On the wall behind him hung a new motto, suggested by Marcus: protect, serve, understand. It wasn't just words anymore. It was a living reality in Maplewood, proving that even in times of fear, compassion and wisdom could prevail over force and suspicion. Winter arrived in Maplewood, bringing unexpected challenges. A severe snowstorm hit the region, causing widespread power outages and leaving many residents stranded. This crisis would test the reformed police department in ways no one had anticipated. Washington stood at his window, watching emergency vehicles navigate the icy streets. His phone buzzed constantly with updates from officers and community leaders. This is where we show what community policing really means, he told Sergeant Martinez during an emergency briefing. Not just in fair weather, but when people need us most. The department transformed its community engagement centers into emergency shelters. Officers who had once been feared now worked alongside residents, distributing blankets and hot meals. Miller, once the department's most controversial officer, organized teams to check on elderly residents. Remember Mrs. Rodriguez? Miller said, helping an elderly woman down her icy steps. She used to record my bad behavior. Now she's teaching me her grandmother's soup recipe for the shelter. The crisis brought out stories that touched everyone. Jenkins discovered a homeless veteran living in his car and brought him to the shelter. The man turned out to be a fellow Vietnam veteran, triggering memories for Washington. Sometimes the people who need help the most are the least likely to ask for it, Washington observed, as he sat talking with the veteran late into the night. Marcus and his youth group surprised everyone by organizing a door-to-door check system, partnering teenagers with officers to ensure no one was forgotten. The same streets where police had once conducted suspicious patrols now saw officers and young people working together to help their neighbors. "Look at this," Washington said to Attorney Chen, who had stopped by to help. "6 months ago, these kids wouldn't even make eye contact with an officer. Now they're planning rescue operations together." The storm's aftermath revealed another dimension of the program's success. Crime rates during the emergency dropped to nearly zero. The community had learned to take care of itself, with police serving as partners rather than just enforcers. One evening, as Washington helped serve meals at the main shelter, he overheard a conversation between James Parker, the reformed robber, and a current officer. "I used to think cops were the enemy," Parker was saying. "Now I understand they're just people trying to help other people. Sometimes they just forget that's their real job." The national news crews returned, expecting to cover storm damage, but found a more compelling story. They filmed officers helping dig out cars, playing basketball with kids in the shelter, and coordinating with community leaders to distribute resources. "This isn't just emergency response," Washington explained to reporters. "This is what happens when a police department truly becomes part of its community." As power was gradually restored, Washington gathered his team for a reflection session. The room was tired but energized. "The storm taught us something important," Sergeant Martinez said. "When people trust each other, crisis brings out the best in everyone." Officer Miller nodded. "I used to think power came from making people fear us. Now I understand it comes from making people trust us." The department began documenting their emergency response methods, creating a new section in their training manual called Community First Crisis Response. Other departments started requesting copies, seeing how Maplewood had turned a natural disaster into an opportunity for deeper community bonds. As Part 7 drew to a close, Washington sat in his study, adding notes to the manual. A photo caught his eye. It showed Marcus and Officer Jenkins sharing a laugh while shoveling snow from an elderly couple's driveway. "Sometimes," he wrote, "the greatest changes come not from grand plans, but from simple moments of human connection." Outside, the snow was melting, but the warmth within the community remained. The emergency shelters were closing, but the relationships built during the crisis would last. Officers and residents exchanged phone numbers, made plans for future community events, and talked about preparing for next winter together. Washington smiled, remembering something his old sergeant had said in Vietnam. "The true test of a unit isn't how they fight, but how they take care of each other." Maplewood had passed that test, proving that when police and community truly unite, they can weather any storm. 1 year after the fateful traffic stop that started it all, Maplewood prepared to host a national conference on police reform. Departments from across the country would come to learn from their success story. Washington stood at the podium in the newly renovated community center, looking out at a sea of faces. There were police chiefs from major cities, community activists, reformed officers, and local residents. In the front row sat Officer Miller, Marcus, and Mrs. Rodriguez, living symbols of how far they come. "A year ago, I stood in handcuffs not far from here," Washington began. "Today, I stand before you not to celebrate a victory, but to share a journey that's still ongoing." The conference wasn't just about presentations and speeches. Washington had insisted on practical demonstrations. Visitors participated in role-playing exercises, joined community dialogue sessions, and witnessed the daily operations of their reform department. During a break, Miller approached Washington with news that brought tears to both their eyes. The State Police Academy had adopted their training program as mandatory curriculum for all new officers. "Your arrest was the worst mistake of my career," Miller said, "but it led to the most important work of my life." Marcus, now heading the youth outreach program, led a session on building trust between young people and law enforcement. The teenagers who once feared police were now teaching officers how to connect with the next generation. "Change isn't just about policies," Marcus explained to the visitors. "It's about seeing each other as human beings first." Sergeant Martinez presented data showing dramatic improvements. Use of force incidents down 80%, community trust up 90%, and crime rates falling steadily. But more importantly, she shared stories of transformation, officers who had rediscovered their calling to serve and protect. The conference's most powerful moment came during a special ceremony. Washington had arranged for officers who had faced disciplinary actions to meet publicly with people they had wronged in the past. Together, they shared their stories of conflict, reconciliation, and growth. James Parker, once arrested for robbery, now stood beside the officers who had caught him, discussing their joint efforts to create job opportunities for at-risk community members. "We're not just preventing crime," Parker said. "We're building a community where people don't feel desperate enough to commit crimes in the first place." As the conference drew to a close, Washington revealed one final initiative. The department was establishing a scholarship fund for young people interested in law enforcement careers, with a focus on building a police force that truly reflected their community's diversity. "The work we've done here isn't finished," Washington told the attendees. "It's just beginning. Each of you will take these ideas back to your communities, but remember, true change starts with honest self-reflection and the courage to admit when we're wrong." That evening, Washington walked through the quiet streets of Maplewood. He passed the community centers that had once been empty storefronts, now buzzing with activity. He saw officers playing basketball with local kids, elderly residents chatting comfortably with patrol officers, and former adversaries working together on community projects. Back home, he sat down to make one final entry in the program manual. As he wrote, he thought about how far they'd come, from a moment of injustice to a movement of transformation. "The greatest lesson we've learned," he wrote, "is that change isn't about forgetting the past, but about using it to build a better future. Every mistake can become a stepping stone if we have the courage to learn from it." Outside his window, a new shift of officers was starting their patrol. They wore their badges not as symbols of authority, but as commitments to service. The streets they patrolled weren't just their beat, they were their home. Washington closed the manual and smiled. The incident that had brought him such pain had become the catalyst for profound change. Maplewood wasn't perfect, no community is, but they had shown what was possible when people chose understanding over fear, growth over revenge, and hope over hatred. The story of Maplewood's transformation would continue long after Washington, but its lessons would ripple out across the country, proving that even in the darkest moments, light could emerge if people were brave enough to stand for justice with wisdom, compassion, and unwavering dignity.